Good morning. It is Wednesday, November 20th, and we are here in our favorite place, the Gian Chapel, and I am so excited to be in this chair today. We are going to be having a conversation today about perspective. For the last several weeks, we've been talking about the tsuris and the challenge that our ancestors have faced. And interestingly, in this week's Parsha, we learned that their tsuris is somehow metabolized into blessing, that our ancestors, Sarah and Abraham, at the end of their life, are able to see their life through the lens of blessing. And so our question is, what is that? How do we do that? Is there a way for us to build those skills? Is that even possible? And if it were, what would that mean for our lives today? So let's bless the Torah that we're going to learn.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי תורה, וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחרבנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
So to begin with, I'd love to go and look inside at the Rashi at the beginning of our Parsha this week and at the first verse of chapter 24 in Genesis. Wes, would you read?
Absolutely. So the verse is Sarah's lifetime. The span of Sarah's life came to 127 years. And Rashi's comment on that is the years of Sarah's life, Shnei Chayei Sarah. The word years is repeated and without a number to indicate that they were all equally good.
And then verse 24, chapter 24, verse 1?
Yes, so Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Va'adonai berach et Avraham bakol.
So I just want to ask a very simple question, which is, do you find this credible? Is it credible that the years of infertility and the years of conflict and the years of trauma and the years of warring were all blessing and or were all equally good?
Well, to begin with, you have to believe that a person can live until 127. Now I understand the phrase when you guys bless somebody on Shabbat morning and say until 120 and then we'll renegotiate. So, 7 more years. So you have to go by that. And I don't know, it's hard to see that. It's a beautiful way of hopefully ending your life, but I'm not so sure.
I love this Rashi, Elisa, because it picks up, if you look at the verse, it does say Chayei Sarah twice. Vayu Chayei Sarah. And that the first one is the one that gets all the press because the portion is called Chayei Sarah. But then the same verse ends with Chayei Sarah. So Rashi is right that there's 2 Chayei Sarahs in the same verse. And I take his comment to mean that for Sarah and for all of us, our life exists at 2 levels. There's the level of facts, like what are the facts of our life? And then there's the level of attitude. How do we see the facts? As you call it, the perspective. How do we see it? And what I hear him saying is that how we see our facts is at least as important as the facts that we see. And that if we see blessing, we are blessed. And if we don't see blessing, we are not blessed. So I think the energy of both verses you brought to us is challenging us to see even hard facts as blessing. Of course, it doesn't take work to see true blessing as blessing. By definition, you only need to exercise your seeing muscles when it's really hard to see, and I think that's the challenge.
I find this such an interesting gloss to look through because it's not, of course, the only way to interpret this. Although if you look on Chabad's website, which they have a brilliant translation week by week by week of all of the parshiot, but one of the very interesting things you see is that every translation is an interpretation, and they actually translate this verse as the pshat is what Rashi is saying here. But there's another really I think, equally cogent interpretation, which is quite lovely, which is that the 100 is separated out because at 100, Sarah was still as beautiful as she had been at 20, and at 20 and at 100, she was as pure of spirit and soul as she had been at 7, and that it's the idea of sort of carrying with you that zest for life, that ability to maintain youthful hopefulness, that translation pulls out, which really doesn't have to make the argument that we're making here, that every part was kind of equally good.
Yeah, I was thinking also that this, the retrospective idea, because we don't get Abraham being Barech Bakol until the end of his life. With Sarah, it's the end of their life. So it maybe, it's interesting to think about in the moments of the war, in the moments of the family strife and in the infertility, maybe you can say, well, maybe she didn't feel blessed, but Sofa Kol at the end, when everything comes to fruition, so looking through the back mirror, looking that way. So maybe that's the way that Rashi is thinking of this as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan, because I think the Abraham comment is, at least for me, easier to get with. I buy the Abraham comment that he's blessed Bakol at the end of his life because he did have so many different, what does Bakol mean? It's not only good, it's also the hardships that he had, and that those two were a piece of the blessing of his life that he carries, and that's about perspective. Sarah, this Rashi's a little bit harder because it's a little less credible.
And how do we understand neither Abraham nor Sarah is actually speaking in either in the Rashi or in this verse? Is that an external perspective or is that an internal perspective? How do you read this? Do you think they got there, or do you think this is the external perspective of others looking in on their life?
Well, that's such an interesting question. Let's think about Sarah for a second. She feels like such a bitter, hard, sad woman. And what she does is so bitter, sad, and hard. Mistreating Hagar, subjecting her to psychological and other kind of abuse that we read about last week, banishing her and her young son that she brought into the world. Actually, in the Talmud class last week, Michael Gardner brought in a picture of a sculpture that's at a museum in Miami, and it's very haunting. You see the desperateness of Hagar. You see the pain of Abraham and Ishmael, and you see Sarah in the background. She's the force that's causing all this pain. So the pshat of the Torah seems to be that she had a very hard life. You can't, you have to have sympathy for that kind of pain, but that she had a hard life and she was hard in her life to other people. So the notion that somehow everything was lovely and all of it came out smelling like a rose does feel like an imposition on her life, not like how she actually experienced her life.
And do you find it to be helpful? Like, do you feel like that's a helpful imposition, or would it be more helpful to say she was cold and hard and traumatized her whole life, and that just kind of is for sometimes?
Well, I find it really helpful that the patriarch and matriarch of our people had such challenged lives, that they were far from perfect, and they had far from perfect lives. And I find it super helpful that they had a ton of pain in their life. That makes them very relatable and accessible to me, anyway. And I take this challenge to be. Shira's always telling me all the time that I'll worry about X, and I'll spend years worrying about X, and then X doesn't come to pass, and she'll say, you see, you spent all this time worrying about X and it never came to pass. Look about how much of your life you wasted worrying about X.
Can I have some sessions with her?
Yes. and therefore, if instead of letting the tough stuff get you down, you somehow figure a way to rise above the waves, you would have a better life. And I feel like that's the challenge of this Rashi. Not that Sarah did it, but that we should try to do it a bit more in our own lives.
And also that the sense of perspective that I think you're right that there is an an overview. And the overview is, if we are those that believe that the Torah has many different versions, many different authors, that the overarching idea of our patriarchs is something that we are trying to emulate in some way. Yes, they have strife. Yes, they have complex lives. But in the end, things can come out well. So I think that's kind of the view that the authors of the Torah are trying to present by showing that at the end of their lives, that even though it wasn't easy, that in the end things can go well.
So a couple of things that come to mind is another perspective of this is how much sometimes your life, your external life, and your interior life don't match with each other. How much you believe that, somebody will, how many times we watch other people, famous people from outside, and says, oh, I wish I could have the life they have. And perhaps they are not that happy because they have their own worries, they have their own challenges, they are constantly comparing themselves to somebody else. So that gap is one of the hardest things in life, to be able to come to terms with your own reality and to appreciate it, or, vice versa.
I'm so grateful for this lens on internal and external, the internal experience and internal perspective and the external perspective. I want to move to our next source, which comes from Baba Metzia, and it's a midrash that comes on the verse 24:1 about Abraham, and reframes, I think, a lived experience that at least I never got to, as being a positive, but has a very interesting spin, and I wonder if it has applications for us. Michelle, do you want to read?
The Gemara continues discussing Abraham. Until Abraham, there was no aging, i.e., old age was not physically recognizable. Consequently, one who wanted to speak to Abraham would mistakenly speak to Isaac, and vice versa. An individual who wanted to speak to Isaac would speak to Abraham, as they were indistinguishable. Abraham came and prayed for mercy, and aging was at last noticeable. As it is stated, and Abraham was old, well stricken in age, which is the first time that aging is mentioned in the Bible. Until Jacob, there was no illness leading to death. Rather, one would die suddenly. Jacob came and prayed for mercy. An illness was brought to the world, allowing one to prepare for his death. As it is stated, and one said to Joseph, behold, your father is sick, which is the first time that sickness preceding death is mentioned in the Bible.
So the lesson learned is don't ask for mercy.
Yeah, I agree with that. The idea that not knowing when your death is going to come, I think, might be an easier way to live. In other words, as you get older, as you have illnesses and challenges, and you start thinking about your mortality, I think that's hard. It's really hard, and it might be easier to just not know, and not think about it. So yes, I agree. That doesn't feel particularly merciful.
Well, although, all of us have been at the bedside of people who are in their final chapters, and with all the horrors that often entails of being stricken with terrible illness at the end, and no one would order, as Wes, you say, order that up on the menu. That wouldn't have been the request. At the same time, there are, I'm aware of many times where people say, I'm so glad that we had this last month. We said everything we had to say. We were able to really come to terms and grapple and understand that this was a reality, and it gave us a chance to prepare for this moment in a way that we didn't appreciate. And I think the same about aging. There is a positive piece about aging where, maybe you're slowing down and not doing as many things as you might have done physically or, out in the world. And that gives you a little bit more time to be reflective and be thoughtful and be wise and help the next generation. And maybe you would have chosen that or you wouldn't have chosen that, but blessings can emerge from it that you wouldn't have requested. It's not a mercy you would have said thank you for, but when you experience it, sometimes it can be something to be grateful for.
What can I know why you decided to bring this text specifically?
Yeah, I've always loved this midrash. I have this weird obsession with this midrash, and I love it particularly because it's not necessarily the feeling you would get on your own about these processes. Like no one, as you said, no one says, "Wow, thank you so much," and at the same time, it feels like an external teaching about what is a perspective that you could adopt. You know, were I a high enough person or a spiritual enough person that I could develop this practice? Wow, wouldn't that be amazing that I could be in this experience that I don't always experience as positive and be like, wow, I'm so grateful that you can tell that I am this age. I'm so grateful that I'm now starting to have gray hairs. Wow, you can tell that I am this old. That's what a blessing that is, that no one's going to confuse me for my child.
Elisa, I see this latest text as exactly continuous with the first text about Abraham and Sarah, because the Abraham and Sarah texts are, how do you look at the bumpy parts, at the hard parts, and see blessing? You know, how does Sarah see her infertility and her wandering and her pain, and Hagar could get pregnant and she couldn't, and how does she look at that and say it's, in a deep way, it's all good and it's all blessing? And how does Abraham look at the 10 ordeals of Abraham and say, God bless me in everything? And to me, this third one about aging and death is, what's the toughest thing of all? That we die. And what's even tougher than we die? Very often we get sick before we die. You know, sometimes the death actually is merciful because the 2 years before are even worse, right? So, and I think this midrash is asking the question, is there a way to see the toughest stuff on planet Earth, that you die, and that you, and you know, Sherwin Nuland says in his book, How We Die, Nobody Dies the Same Way. Everybody has a different death, and sometimes your death might be merciful and short, but sometimes it could be a schlepped out situation, really horrible, etc. And I think this midrash is asking, is there a way to see even that, even the dying, even the death, as a blessing? And I think the highest religious order is, I mean, here we are in the Gann Chapel, and here we are, the sun is streaming through the beautiful window, and here every day we say, Baruch Hu, and then we say, Yotzer Or, Uvorei Choshech, Osei Shalom, Uvorei Et HaKol. So every day in this sacred space, the spiritual aspiration is light and darkness all come from God. And it's easy to see the light comes from God. But the prayer every day we say after Baruch Hu is Yotzer Or, Uvorei Choshech. And is there some way that even the Choshech, which is a part of life, can we also see that comes from God? Much easier to say than to do, but I think that's what this midrash is also about.
One of the things I love about this class today is, one, that you brought beautiful text, and second, that he's not asking the questions, so we hear his voice. But it's so beautiful and so enlightening. So thank you, Elisa, for that.
So much fun. All right, we're going to continue. I have had a crush on this next text for a very long time. As my colleagues know, I've been obsessed with it. This is a story of improbable optimism. And Elias, I know you also have an affinity for this text. Will you read it for us?
Yeah, I never read so much English together in my life. But here we go. The Gemara inquires, and why did they call him Nahum of Gamzu? The reason is that with regard to any matter that occurred to him, he would say, this too is for the good. Gamze letovah. Once the Jews wished to send a gift, Doron, to the house of the emperor. They said, who should go and present these gifts? Let Nahum of Gamzu go, as he is accustomed to miracles. They sent with him a chest, siftah, full of jewels and pearls, and he went and spent the night in a certain inn. During the night, these residents of the inn rose and took all of the precious jewels and pearls from the chest and filled it with earth. The next day, when he saw what had happened, Nahum Gamzu said, this too is for the good. When he arrived there, at the ruler's palace, They opened the chest and saw that it was filled with earth. The king wished to put all the Jews' emissaries to death. He said, the Jews are mocking me. Nahum of Gamzu said, this too is for the good. Elijah the prophet came and appeared before the ruler as one of his ministers. He said to the ruler, perhaps this earth is from the earth of their father Abraham, as when he threw earth, it turned into swords, and when he threw stubble, it turned into arrows. And is it written in a prophecy that the sages interpreted this verse as a reference to Abraham? His sword makes them as the dust, his bow as the driven stubble. There was one province that the Romans were unable to conquer. They took some of this earth, tested it by throwing it at the enemies, and conquered that province. When the ruler saw that this earth indeed had miracle powers, his servant entered his treasure and filled Nahum of Gamzu's chest with precious jewels and pearls, and sent him off with great honor. When Nahum of Gamzu came to spend the night at the same inn, the residents said to him, why did you bring with you to the emperor that he bestowed upon you such great honor? He said to them, that which I took from here I brought there. When they heard this, the residents of the inn thought that the soil upon which their house stood had miracles powers. They tore down their inn, and brought the soil underneath to the king's palace. They said to him, that earth that was brought here was from our property. The miracle had been performed only in the merit of Nahum of Gamzu. The emperor tested the inn's soil in battle, and it was not found to have miraculous powers. And he had these residents of the inn put to death. Happy ending, go to sleep.
And you love that story.
I love this story. I'm so obsessed with this story. You're not obsessed with this story.
I'm not asking questions, but if I were, I would ask the question, what do you love about the story?
Oh, it's epic. It's so epic. But tell me what you don't love about it. Let's start with what you don't love about
I
this
love
story.
the optimism about this guy. It's like, I'm going to get killed because I don't have the jewels. So any person will run away. And he goes and offers earth and creates this rabbinical interpretation about, this can get you a long way, you guys. Use this story when you get in trouble in the future. It's amazing, the optimism. It's unbelievable.
But is it credible?
Do you believe Sarah lived 127 years?
Well, I'm reading this. We've got tonight. We have Yossi Klein Halevi coming to talk about Israel. What a hot mess! Our country so divided. I'm wondering whether it's a nice story to read a granddaughter if she's 3. Is it a nice story to live by in this hard world?
To that, I feel now you're asking the questions. It's great.
I'm sorry.
I love it.
I'm done.
I love it. No, but I think, yes, to me, this story is about when you can't see any optimism, when there's no optimism on the horizon, when there are no good options, that if you are able to cultivate this kind of perspective, if you're able to cultivate a vision that this too could be for good, then you can generate a positive reality, because these other people, right, the general in people are just looking to capitalize on opportunity. It's not about this as being a general good. They're just like, I want to make money. I want to have an asset here, and I'm just going to take down this inn and bring in this dirt for the purpose of earning money. That doesn't do it. But the perspective of everything is for good does, and that has literally changes the alchemy of the soil on which you stand.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the perspective that changes the alchemy. I think he's in such a mess that, it says the angel, like the intervention arrives because of his merit, right? And his merit is one of true faith. Like, I don't know what's going to happen in this moment, but I believe it will be for the good, and that kind of vulnerability generates a sense of the need to protect him in that moment. So I think you could say, oh, so that means all of us should be this way, but Dafka, I think the fact that the innkeepers don't get there. It's not a story of everybody go be like him, because it specifically doesn't. They don't get the attitude, and it doesn't transfer, and it doesn't work for him. And ultimately, it's like a Grimm's fairy tale. I imagine you reading this to Eder as a bedtime story, right? And they were all killed, right, for being
Purim.
in the sense, right, that there is some sense of vindictiveness also to this story, and a sense of that this is not necessarily an attainable goal for all. Nachumish Gamzu is particularly unique in this moment.
But there's also, sorry, go ahead.
But I would say actually that in a certain way it's teaching us that optimism is, as Elias pointed out, is a good thing. Think about the movie The Shawshank Redemption. You know, hope is a good thing, optimism is a good thing. People that live their lives with optimism in the face of complexity, in the face of the difficulties of their lives, will oftentimes be better and feel better. And so I think this is teaching us, this midrash is teaching us about that optimism. The other thing to think about, Wes, is that America has been in hard straits before, and just because we're in a very difficult time now, we also need to be optimistic that it won't last. Israel has been in very hard times before. I would say yes, you're right. Maybe this is the worst that it's been in a very, very long time. But if we go about our lives, and if we go about working with Israel and towards Israel and thinking about Israel and praying for Israel, that optimistic view that this too shall pass, and that Israel does have a future, I think is part of what this midrash is trying to bring us.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things. So first of all, answering Wes's question, I don't believe that the story is credible, all right, to begin with. And if you compare with the harsh reality that we are experiencing both in America and in Israel, obviously you cannot believe this is true. That being said, it's about the optimism. But it's also something about, how naive sometimes we can be, and sometimes we need somebody, an outside figure who comes and either saves us or put us in a good track, like Elijah. Elijah, why did he appear all of a sudden and started to protect this guy? Because he probably believed that this guy was pure, that he didn't have any malicious thought, that he thought that the world is a beautiful place, I'm going to be appreciated for my earth as well as for my jewels. And then he came to protect him. So there is something also to be said about Elijah.
Yeah, there's also this really cool sense here of Nachumish Gamzu doesn't do the thing that we normally would do, like, oh, that's earth, I'd better not go. He actually says, all right, here I am. This is the situation that I'm in. I'm going to make the best of this situation that I have, and have the vulnerability and the faith to see what the outcome would be. Because when there are no good outcomes, sometimes approaching the outcome that you have with a clear and pure heart may be the best of your options.
I mean, me personally, I would have run away. I woke up in the morning and I have this earth on my chest. I run away.
Right, no one's expecting you. There's not really like, oh, he didn't show today. There's another character that we haven't really interrogated, which is the residents of the inn. We see them at the end as having tried to take the inn down in order to get the soil. But at the beginning of the story, they actually get up in the middle of the night and they fill his chest with dirt. They're thieves. And so when you talk about the fairy tale essence, like this is a just desserts situation. But I have this question about what's that role? Who are the in residence in our lives? Like what is that, and how does that function in the story? Because I think it's actually a very important case study.
So I feel like if anything, that would be the takeaway from this story, because you have this Nachumish Gamzu, and he's amazing, right? He can hold his calm. In a sense, if I was teaching this to kids, they are the villain of don't be like them, right? They're the moral takeaway. Don't seek your personal gain at the expense of others. It's not going to work out well for you.
Do you see them in any way?
Looks like you want to talk, Wes.
No. It just struck me. This is very Yigdal. Notain l'rasharo karishato. that God will give to the evil their just deserts. And it's very that's an aspect of the story that's very satisfying, that God gives to the evil their just deserts. But again, that's an ideal that Sadik Vatovlo Varasha Varalo. But how do you handle the gap between that ideal and the real?
And there's, I think, a way to read this, which is to say, I'm imagining the dialogue of these inn people, and they got up in the middle of the night, they're like, this guy's always such a goodie. He's like, everything is going to be good. Everything's going to be great. We'll show him, right? And then they take his jewels, and that's one way to read it. And if you read it like that, it's like, what happens when and I think we do this to each other all the time, where we say like, oh, don't be so optimistic. Let me tell you how bad the world is. And if you read it that way, and not in the sense of like, they're evil, therefore they get killed, but in the sense of like, when you try to kill people's optimism, it's problematic for you and for them in different ways, right? And it's, who knows how much time goes by that he's stuck in the palace waiting for this magical earth to do its miraculous save. But that feels like a really important read for our lives today, which is that we have to be really cautious about how we talk to each other and how we spin things around such that we're not whipping each other up into frenzies about how bad things could be.
Right, that's so true. And how to do that in the face of news that is persistently challenging, and not to be a Cassandra and not to be a Debbie Downer is just so important and so hard. One thing that I was thinking about from the story is the Shimon Peres, Future Imagination Center in Israel. It's a very inspiring place. I think, Michelle, one of your trips went there as well. There was a beautiful picture. We were there as well, and Shimon Peres famously said, they have a bunch of posters to this effect. I love this. Optimists and pessimists die the same way. They just live differently. And I think that, to me, that's the lesson of this story that I like, is optimists and pessimists do die the same way, but they live differently. And again, this also feels deeply connected to the Abraham and Sarah text, the dying and death text, which is how in the face of hard stuff can you choose to see the good? How can you be, it's easy to be an optimist when things are optimistic. Can you be an optimist when they're not optimistic?
And so we'll turn to our final story, which is on this theme. And by the way, I just want to say there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these stories about optimism. Our tradition is so full of them, and it's particularly fascinating. These I took from the Talmud, but there are many, many, many Hasidic stories to the same effect. Many, many, many moments where people in really dark times wrote stories about optimism. So Dan, will you read this one out? This one has a slightly different feel.
Yes. So this is from Brachot,
Yes.
60b. Rav Huna said that Rabbi Meir said, and so it was taught in a Breita in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we finally get to who's saying. One must always accustom oneself to say, everything that God does for the best. The Gemara relates, like this incident when Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road and came to a certain city, he inquired about lodging, and they did not give him any. He said, everything that God does for the best. He went and slept in a field, and he had with him a rooster, a donkey, and a candle. A gust of wind came and extinguished the candle. A cat came and ate the rooster, and a lion came and ate the donkey. This is like the Haggadah. He said, everything that God does for the best. That night, an army came and took the city into captivity. It turned out that Rabbi Akiva alone, who was not in the city and had no lit candle, noisy rooster, or donkey to give away his location, was saved. He said to them, didn't I tell you? Everything that God does for the best.
What a fabulous story. It should be in the Jewish book of humor. Unbelievable.
So I would say, this is connected to the other one in a certain way. Inns in the Bronze Age were notoriously not safe places. So I think this is pointing out the reality of that. That places were not hospitable to outsiders. Travelers were not welcome in most places. So this is pointing out an historical perspective as well. Of course, this is such fantasy. It's so interesting.
And also, I just want to say, it bears mentioning that it has a very dark shadow side, which is how do you read everything that God does for the best for all the residents of the city and of the inn? Like, that's super, super problematic. Mm-hmm. So when we exist on the surface level of, for Rabbi Akiva, it's great. But then how do we flip that? That's really challenging.
Yeah, on a serious note, the first thing that comes to mind when I read this is that you recall very well that when 9/11 happened, we read after a while so many stories about people who worked at the Twin Towers, and for some reason or another, for strange reasons, they could not get to the job early. A flat tire, or a phone call or something like that, or stuck in traffic, and they didn't die. It was this horrible tragedy, and they saved their lives just because, I don't know, random luck.
Right. Right. Your class is entitled Perspectives, and so if your only perspective is me, Rabbi Akiva has a good perspective, but then you think about the fact that that night an army came and took the city into captivity. So what does it mean that that's the story where you say everything God does for the good? It leaves you with more questions than answers. Can I ask you also, Lisa, since you brought us this, I'm struck most by the framing. Rav Huna said, that Rav said, that Rabbi Meir said, and so it was taught in a Breita in the name of Rabbi Akiva. So there's kind of like 4 authors to this troubling tale. What do you make of that?
It feels like 4 scholars who've been really wrestling with this story, that there are so many, this has come up in so many different contexts as an important teaching, and yet what's the application? How do you use this in a meaningful way? And I'm not sure. I find it like this one, I find even more of a children's tale than any others, just because of the, like, in what universe do you have a cat eating a rooster and a lion eating it? Like, it's the illustrations are too good, and yet it's such a dark underside. How do we think about that? I don't get.
Or in flipping the coin, applying an optimistic view of this text, is that so many of their students of Rabbi Akiva learn about that everything happens for good, that they were going back to the source of this, knowing that 5 generations after, they all learn from him.
And of course, we know, the reader knows, that Rabbi Akiva is martyred at the hands of the Romans, and we know from the martyrology that the Roman soldiers, painfully execute him. And so, again, that leaves you with a lot of questions about everything God does for the best, when the author of that and the putative recipient of that dies a cruel death. Mm-hmm. So this one, of all the texts that you brought, leaves you with a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I love all the texts you brought.
Thank you. I think that it's a really important piece that you can't be too optimistic and you can't be too pessimistic, and that we have to measure those senses, but that there is wisdom. I want to invite all of you to share what's one piece of wisdom, one thing that you're thinking about, something that you're continuing to chew on as we head out of this learning today.
Well, I like to, I appreciate all these texts. Some of them are really funny and beautiful at the same time. But my takeaway is that phrase that Wes brought from Shimon Peres about, we don't know how we are going to pass and what will happen to us, but the optimistic view makes you live a better life, better quality life, and we all hope to attain that. It's not easy.
I think also like learning to be hopeful without also being naive.
I teach my 6th graders every year about Parshat Noach as not a children's story, but what it says for adults. And that last piece that you brought out really wrestles with the question of what happens to everybody else, which I think is a critical question that every human who seeks to kind of grow up in the world that we live in has to engage. So I appreciate in that context this story, which truly is one to wrestle with. And Dan, I really loved you sitting in this chair today. we got a lot, including the connection to
It's a chair full of wisdom.
Yeah. including the connection into, our Chad Gadya in the Pesach story, which I'll really sit with. So thank you for that. But fundamentally, I think my biggest takeaway is from the Nachumish Gamzu story about the vulnerability involved in faith.
First of all, thank you, Lisa. I loved all of these texts. I love the conversation. I think I want to come back to the beginning, though. What sticks for me, what I'll remember a week, a month, a year from now, is Chaye Sarah, Chaye Sarah. That there's two lives that Sarah has, there's two lives that all of us have. There's the life of dry fact, what happens to us, the facts of our life, which is important, no doubt. And then there's Chaye Sarah, there's the dimension of how we see it, the attitude we bring to it, and attitude. And how do we, and for me, the spiritual challenge of these beautiful texts are, it's easy to take happy facts and feel happy. How do I take hard facts and still have legitimate optimism and bring that kind of attitude? Because if you see blessing, then your life is a blessing. And if you don't see blessing, then your life is not a blessing. In the end, each of us has the power to kind of shape how we feel about our life, and that is in such a big way determined by how we see it.
Amen, amen. So our challenge this week and all weeks is to become a gamzu, to be able to build the kind of perspective that enables us to see blessing, and more importantly than see blessing, to enable us to manifest the blessing we wish to see in the world. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.